What do you expect will happen now in the absence of a peace deal? Because the territorial defense going from Gulyapole to Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Siversk, Kupiansk, all of it seems to be falling apart or already fallen to Russia. So how does this change the nature of the war? Because this was a very important defensive line which held the Russians back, and this is collapsing. Not only would the Ukrainians have much fewer troops, less equipment, less support, but their defensive lines are gone. So I don't know. I can imagine if I was sitting in Moscow, I would not be in the mood for a compromise now. So if they do not make a massive compromise, given that they finally punched through this last major defensive line, well, what would you expect happen now if, you would use your military intelligence background as assessing what the Russians could be thinking?
Well, war is an extension of politics by other means. I mean, that's, old Clausewitz there. We can also, I'm sure Sun Tzu said something similar at some point in time in his many pronouncements about war and politics. We have to be careful and thinking solely militarily. I mean, because it's very tempting right now because we've reached the culminating point where Russia now will be able to militarily accomplish things that up until now they haven't been able to. I mean, Odessa is within reach. It is. It's not inconceivable. There's nothing in Kherson right now. If the Russians collapse the Zaporozhye front and come in and cross the Dnieper River in strength, and then they decide to pivot south, the right bank of Kherson will fall along with Mykolaiv, and then they're at the doorstep of Odessa, and nothing can stop them. But now, there's been some frustration expressed in certain circles about Vladimir Putin's lack of, killer instinct. Why hasn't he decapitated, Bankova? Well, because he thinks bigger than simply decapitating Bankova. Remember what came before the special military operation is the Russian draft treaty for European security framework. Russia's thinking in the long term, what's in its best interest. And right now, if Russia can secure the 4 territories that it claims because of the September 2022 referendum, and here's an important thing, and get the United States and Europe to recognize these as Russian territories. If they can end the sanctions that are linked to Crimea in this and normalize economic relations with the world, contrast that with winning military, seizing Odessa, maybe even getting Kharkov. But nobody in the world will recognize this. And along with that, nobody recognizes, and it's a forever situation where sanctions are going to cost you trillions of dollars over the course of the next decade. Strategically, where do you go? And I've just been impressed with Russia's ability to think past the glory and think strategically about where it needs to be down the road. BRICS doesn't function well with one of its members in a permanent state of economic conflict with the West. That's not for a healthy BRICS. And Russia wants BRICS to succeed. Russia wants to be part of BRICS. And the best way that Russia integrates into BRICS is to be a fully functioning nation state with an economy that can be plugged in anywhere in the world, especially with the United States and China simultaneously. So I still believe that Russia's looking for an off-ramp. There is a negotiation there. It's a fine balance. It'll be interesting to see about elections because, the United States, again, there's just some fascinating things going on behind the scenes, unspoken things, the kind of stuff where 2 people sit at a table and sort of look at each other and give that nod, like, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I know what you're talking about. We're not going to say it, right? We don't need to say it, you know? And what I mean by this is the United States, it appears that we're moving towards a total redefinition of what Ukrainian government looks like, to break these power structures that have held Ukraine together since it became an independent state. Why would we do that? Why would we break everything and reform something to benefit Ukrainian democracy? It doesn't exist. The Russians, on the other hand, are sitting there with a government in waiting. They have a plan, they have a vision. It'll be difficult for the Russians to slide in if they have to slide into the old traditional corrupt structures that exist, because Russia doesn't readily integrate into that. But if you break that and you create something new through this peace process, Russia slides in. And Russia, therefore, doesn't need to occupy Odessa, doesn't need to occupy Kharkov. What they do is they give Ukraine options. One, for Ukraine to become part of the Union state. And then Ukraine is like Belarus, visa-free travel. Why? Odessa will be a Russian city. It'll be governed by Ukraine, but it'll be a Russian city. It's visa-free travel. The Russians will now come in. They'll be rebuilding everything. They'll own all of Ukraine. Ukraine will be called Ukraine, but it'll be functioning as a de facto extension of Russia. I think that's the Russian vision. And they can get to that through a semblance of a peace deal. That's a more realistic vision than the one of Europe, retaining the Ukraine that can forever strike Russia. But if Russia moves too fast militarily, seeks to, do too much, they spoil that. Because then what happens is everybody becomes defensive. Russia has to be careful not to be that which Europe accuses them of being. And, a pell-mell rush to occupy territory, to seize territory, to be seen as seeking to grab all of Ukraine, I think Russia would prefer to avoid that. The other thing is it will require more manpower. I mean, the bottom line is, the Russians now have manpower that can take them a certain distance. But to go even further, you're going to need to mobilize additional manpower. I don't think Putin wants to do that. I think the economy right now is geared to be able to sustain at the present rate another year or two of this kind of activity. But to mobilize even more manpower will put strain on the economy. Where's that manpower going to come from? From defense industry jobs, or are you going to weaken the civilian, economic structures so that we start to see collapses of the civilian economy that now has to be propped up at expense and harm to the Russian economy? I think the Russians right now are working with the Trump administration to find a balance that gives Russia everything it wants, but also creates opportunities for Russia going forward that don't require the military to be flexing its muscle. And this is where, again, the Russians, people always, people are just fundamentally ignorant about Russia and what's going on in Russia. I've had the honor and privilege of being able to go into Russia and talk to these people, and you speak to them and you see that there are things happening that the West just either ignores or just isn't aware. There is significant philosophical dialogue going on in Russia about the future of Ukraine, and how to deal with Ukraine that goes far beyond the notion of killing Banderists and and conquering territory. It's a far more sophisticated philosophical, ethical approach to conflict resolution than anybody in the West gives Russia credit for.